Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome everyone to our 37th roundtable and our 77th event since 2022. Today we are hosting Professor Ellie Hua Wang from Chengchi University. She will be presenting on rhythm, alignment, and collective clarity, from affective salience to public order in Xunzi. Our invited discussants are Professor Park Song-Jeong from Sungkyunkwan University. I don't know how badly I said that, sorry. Professor Xu Nai from Taiwan University, and Professor Eric Hutton from the University of Utah. Our chair today is Helen Hua Wang from Columbia University. It's become a tradition here at 四海为学to give some younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to be part of future events, please email me. Our event today will be 90 minutes total, ending promptly at 10:30 a.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Helen, I just want to say a few things about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices sometimes found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks and jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes often found in so-called blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So, before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank everyone for being here with us today. Our chair is Helen Hua Wang, who is a fourth-year philosophy PhD candidate at Columbia University, where she studies literary translation in French and classical Chinese. Her dissertation, funded in part by the SHRC Doctoral Fellowship, explores the relationship between ethics and etiquette through a Confucian lens. She has held numerous leadership roles in university governance and most recently served as the 2025 to 2026 chair of the Student Affairs Committee at the Columbia University Senate. Thank you very much for hosting today, Helen. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Helen. I'm honored to chair today's lecture on rhythm, alignment, and collective clarity from affective salience to public order in Xunzi. Today's lecture will be given by Professor Ellie Hua Wang, who is Associate Professor in the Chair of Philosophy at National Chengchi University. She received her PhD in Philosophy and Cognitive Science from Indiana University Bloomington. Her research focuses on early Confucianism, ethics, and moral psychology, with particular attention to Xunzi and questions in contemporary moral psychology of moral philosophy. Her current work aims to bring Xunzi and resources on ritual, public rhythm, and multi-agent coordination into dialogue with AI ethics and reason-based Western ethics. The format of today's session will be as follows: a 30 to 60-minute lecture by Professor Wang, and following that, comments for up to 5 minutes from each of our 3 commentators. Throughout the lecture, I may briefly interrupt with time reminders to keep us on schedule. And with that, please welcome Professor Ellie Hua Wang.
Thank you, Helen, for the introduction. So now I will try to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see this? Yes. Okay, all right. So thank you also, Paul, for your very kind invitations. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present this work, especially because so many good friends are here to engage with it. So let's start. Just 2 weeks ago, I led a group of graduate students to the University of Tokyo for an academic exchange. So during that visit, I found myself thinking a lot about trains. This may sound like a tourist observation, but for me, it quickly became a philosophical one. So what struck me was not really just how effective the railway system in Tokyo was. It was that it offers a very vivid example of a form of order that is neither reducible to a single center nor collapsible into mere spontaneity. So different railway companies have their own histories, routes, vehicles, interests, and operational tempos. Yet they become connectable through shared formats. Station names, platforms, timetables, ticket systems, signs, announcements, transfer routes, and sometimes even through line service arrangements. So these formats do not erase difference. They articulate difference into forms that can be recognized, anticipated, and taken up by others. Okay, I'll close this. So in this sense, the railway system offers a living image of what I will later call qi. Qi does not mean simply uniformity. It means alignment, connectivity, and the possibility of moving together within a shared public rhythm. So I was staying in Akasaka Misuke, a business district, commercial district. I was told that while the area has only a relatively small residential population, during working hours, an enormous number of office or workers, about 2 million, move into and through this district. So because I was staying in such a busy area, I asked a Japanese friend whether going to the station during the morning rush hour would be difficult. And she told me not to worry too much because the people there are, as she puts it, professional commuters. So at first I didn't quite understand what she meant, but then I realized that this was a very precise description. So these commuters are not simply individuals following explicit rules. They have been trained into a public rhythm that distributes positions, movements, expectations, and transitions. They know when to speed up, when to slow down, where to stand, how to queue, how to yield, how to enter, exit, and transfer, often without any verbal instruction. So the smoothness of the flow does not come simply from central command. It comes from shared formats, trained bodies, environmental cues, and public rhythms. So this observation brings me to one of the central questions of my talk today, which is, before anything can count in favor of anything, what has already been put in place? That is, before we ask what reasons justify an action or what rules commanded, what forms of rhythm and alignment already make shared action possible? So to answer this question, This talk develops a Xunzian account of public order by extending a broader project I've been working on, which I call a rhythm first model of ethical understanding. So by rhythm first, I mean that ethical understanding begins not from explicit reasons, but from the rhythmic articulation through which a practical field comes into being. A field in which something comes to matter, presses upon us, opens up possible paths for response, and is carried forward into shared forms of action. So this stance does not deny the importance of reasons, principles, or explicit judgments. It asks about the conditions under which anything can become a reason, a principle that can be applied, or a judgment that can be fitting. So before something can be articulated as a reason, it must already have emerged as a practical significance within an articulated field of salience, timing, position, affective uptake, and possible response. In this sense, reason is a second-order articulation built upon a prior practical articulation. So by affective uptake, I mean the way a situation is first registered through feeling, attention, and body orientation as mattering, as pressing upon us, calling for a response or requiring adjustments. Something may strike us as urgent, moving, or disturbing, or shameful, or out of place, or fitting before we have fully articulated why. So in the background of this argument is a fivefold model of fittingness: temporal attunement, spatial positioning, contextual particularity, historical embeddedness, and inner regulation. I will not develop all five dimensions today, but they help explain why rhythm is not merely temporal. Rhythm is the patterned unfolding through which a practical field is articulated, advanced, coordinated, and sustained. So I reconstruct this broader model through a philosophical arc across Mencius, Zhuangzi, and Xunzi. I think Mencius shows how the world first presses upon us through affective pull. Something comes to matter and calls for response. And Zhuangzi shows how one moves through articulated openings. Fitting response requires skillful pathing through pressure, blockage, and change. And Xunzi brings this arc into a domain of public order. Shared life must be given joints through which it can be carried forward. So his question is how affective pull and skillful pathing can become teachable, transmissible, repairable through ritual articulation. So let me briefly explain this arc before turning to Xunzi. Mencius shows that ethical response begins before explicit deliberation has taken shape. In the famous Child at the Well passage, he writes this: the point here, I think, is not that the observer first reasons to a conclusion. The scene itself presses upon the observer with urgency. The child's vulnerability, the immediacy of danger, and the demand for response arriving together. This is the ignition of salience. A situation becomes charged with normative force and begins to orient action. So Mencius gives us another important example. When he describes the body manifestation of a moral pull, the context is a striking passage about burial. Mencius imagines an earlier age in which some people did not bury their parents. When a parent died, the body was simply thrown into a ravine. Later, when the son passed by and saw foxes eating the body and flies swarming over it, the reaction was immediate and bodily. the sweat on the forehead, the sideways glance, and the inability to look directly are not performed for others. They register a felt recognition that something is deeply out of place. The scene is taken up affectively before it is articulated as a doctrine about burial or filial obligation. Here, ethical salience is not merely an inner feeling. It becomes bodily legible. It reaches the face, the eyes, the posture. And Mencius therefore helps us see that ethical understanding begins from a prior orientation toward what matters before it is stabilized into explicit judgment or public form. So, of course, Zhuangzi then complicates the picture. Mencius shows us how ethical salience is ignited, and Zhuangzi shows us that the salience and response cannot remain fixed. The question we're dealing with is not only what matters; it is also how one responds when inherited scripts, immediate affective cues, or conventional forms no longer suffice. So a striking example is the story of Zhuangzi drumming on a basin and singing after his wife's death. So the point in this passage, I think, is not that grief disappears, right? So Zhuangzi says that at first he too felt deeply affected. What changes is the configuration through which the loss is understood and inhabited. By placing death within a broader sequence of transformation, he repositions himself in relation to his wife, to mourning, and to change itself. So in that situation, and given that transformed understanding and inner condition, drumming and singing may become fitting response rather than a failure of mourning. So this example is important because it shows that ethical response cannot be measured simply by conformity to an inherited emotional script. A response may need to be reattuned before it can become fitting. Now, Cook-Ding then gives us a more technical and embodied model of how such reattunement works as skill. So let's look at this passage. And I just want to very quickly draw your attention to this term, 奏刀. It will come up again later. So this passage gives us a model of knowing as path-sensitive responsiveness. Cook-Ding does not simply apply a rule to an object. He enters a field of joints, openings, pressures, and possible movements. So he knows where to enter, where to avoid, when to stop, when to slow down, and how to re-enter with precision. So I think three features are especially important here. First, knowing appears as a trained caring state, a cultivated condition of responsiveness. Second, knowing is pathing. So that it is the capacity to move through a concrete structure by sensing opening and limits. Third, knowing involves rhythmic adjustment. At difficult points, one stops, slows down, and moves subtly. So Zhuangzi therefore cautions us against treating ethical understanding as the fixed application of stable forms. He shows that fitting response requires anti-fixity, reattunement, and tempo-sensitive adjustment. Yet, I think Zhuangzi also leaves us with a problem. Such responsiveness remains closely tied to individual mastery. It is powerful, but difficult to teach, transmit, institutionalize, and publicly sustain. So I think this is where Xunzi becomes very crucial. A good example is mourning. For Xunzi, mourning ritual does not simply express grief. nor does it suppress it. It deals with a rupture in relational rhythm that interrupts a relation that had been interactive. Ritual arranges this rupture into a sequence that can be walked through, expressed, and jointly born. In this sense, ritual does not erase rupture. It gives rupture a public form. So Xunzi does not discard the dynamic intelligence visible in Zhuangzi, nor does he reject the affective pole emphasized by Mencius. He transforms both into a common world. From Mencius, he takes the problem of how things first come to matter and press upon us. And from Zhuangzi, he takes the problem of how one finds a viable path through pressure, blockage, and change. And Xunzi's distinctive question is how these capacities can become public. So for him, I think ritual is a practice that skillfully turns affective pole into scale. Affective pole is not eliminated. It is externalized into public forms that can be learned, taken up, repeated, and repaired. So in the following, I focus on Xunzi. I will argue that Xunzi transforms rhythm into a public medium of alignment. And then he pushes alignment toward collective clarity. So let me begin with the term rhythm. I use rhythm here in a deliberately broad sense. I do not mean rhythm only in the narrower music theoretical sense. Rather, I'm interested in how rhythm belongs to a broader collaborative grammar in Xunzi, one that operates across musical, ritual, and political domains and addresses questions of collective action, public order, and governance. So in this sense, rhythm is not simply tempo. Tempo concerns how fast something moves. Rhythm, as I use the term here, concerns how action is articulated, intensified, delayed, connected, redirected, and brought to completion. It is not only temporal. It also coordinates space, body, role, affect, attention, and inherited form, and public intelligibility. So my aim is that rhythm in the Xunzi is not an ordinary term for order, nor a rhetorical metaphor that simply borrows music to describe politics. It is better understood as part of a collaborative grammar. By grammar, I do not mean a linguistic grammar only. I mean a patterned set of forms through which actions become mutually intelligible and practically connectable. So more specifically, this grammar is composed of 节奏qi, and together, these terms explain how differentiated actions, roles, bodies, procedures, and meanings can be brought into sustainable public order. So let's examine each component more closely. Xunzi's use of 节 goes far beyond the idea of restraint. In many contexts, 节 is better understood as a form of articulation. The structuring of activity through division, connection, measure, and coordinated movement. So in this passage, we see ritual provides the standard of 节, that is, it provides the measure by which human relations and conduct are properly articulated. Ritual establishes relational order by determining how persons, roles, actions, and expectations are to be differentiated and connected and coordinated. So the English word articulation here, I think, is especially illuminating. To articulate something is not merely to express it. it is to divide it into meaningful joints, to give it structure, to make its parts connectable and thereby render it intelligible. So articulation simultaneously differentiates and connects. It creates distinctions without producing fragmentation and establishes relations without collapsing differences. So to articulate is therefore not to merely divide a field, but it makes the parts of the field appear in intelligible relation. So if you read it in this way, Jie names a fundamental orientation of human life. It divides continuous flows of affect, desire, action, and interaction into recognizable segments. It regulates excess and deficiency. It establishes nodes through which different activities become connectable, and it gives conduct a pattern of advance, pause, transition, return, and completion. So according to this passage, ritual is therefore not simply restriction imposed upon desire. It is a world-shaping practice that renders desires, emotions, roles, relationships, actions, temporal sequences, and the spatial arrangements properly differentiated, coordinated, and publicly intelligible. So the segments, we just talked about Jie. The semantic range of Jie further supports this interpretation. At the most concrete level, Jie refers to physical joints and nodes, such as segments of bamboo or the joints of the body, 关节, 主节. In such cases, Jie does not interrupt functioning. Rather, it makes coordinated movements possible. A limb moves because it is articulated. So Xunzi also employs Jie in temporal contexts, such as this. Here, Jie refers to the articulated pacing of seasonal transformation. It marks proper intervals, recurrent transitions, and the temporal structuring through which growth becomes possible. Seasonal regularity is not mere repetition, but an ordered articulation of change. The concept extends further into the ethical and political domain. So here, in strengthening of the state, E concerns the articulation of the practical field itself. It establishes the distinctions, proportions, and relations through which both inner dispositions and worldly engagements become intelligible and fitting. So put it differently, E names the work of articulating oneself and one's worldly engagements into a fitting ethical order. Through such articulation, dispositions, actions, and circumstances become properly distinguished, connected, and coordinated. So across these contexts, the word 节 functions as a remarkably consistent concept. Whether referring to bodily structure or temporal order or ritual practice or ethical responsiveness or political coordination, its role is the same: to transform continuous activity into articulated form. Jie is the operation through which continuous life becomes articulable and through which an ethical world becomes inhabitable. It is the condition under which movement acquires structure, relations become intelligible, and collective life becomes possible. So the second component is Zhou. In early Chinese contexts, Zhou carries senses of presentation, advancement, convergence, and formation. For example, in the Shangshu, we find this. Here, Zhou suggests presentation and bringing something forward. In another passage, the term again carries a sense of forwarding or bringing something into availability. In musical contexts, Zhou, of course, also has the sense of performance. So this is 诗经. The musical sense itself is also important for my argument. Musical performance is not mere sound production. It is coordinated presentation. Multiple sounds are brought into form, sequence, and patterned relation. And this helps us read Xunzi's line here. This phrase can be understood as indicating that the pattern of the world has roughly come together, and that its order has begun to take shape. Zhou here points to the formation of a minimally operative order. In fact, he's talking about Ba here, the hegemon rule. It marks the moment when scattered elements begin to converge into an intelligible configuration. So when we place Jie and Zhou and together, then before we can turn to Qi, Jiezhou names a form in which articulation and convergence work together. Through Jie, activity is segmented and measured. Through Zhou, differentiated elements are brought into relation in forward movement. So the third term is qi. In Xunzi, qi should not be read as the flattening of difference. Xunzi's criticism of Mozi is pretty telling here. Now, the problem here is a fixation on sameness, a failure to see irregularity, differentiation, and unevenness. This passage helps us avoid a simplistic reading of Xunzi's own positive use of qi as mere uniformity. In the context I examine today, qi functions as an operative verb. It brings differentiated actors, positions, actions, and voices into a shared rhythm without dissolving their differences. It means alignment, uptake, mutual uptake, and coordinated participation. So here we can see the basic structure. Jie establishes articulation and measure. Zhou advances differentiated elements into formation in movement. And qi makes that movement publicly sustainable. It brings the many into a shared public scale. Together, they form a dynamic grammar of coordination. So now we have seen this grammar, let's look at some texts. The most direct entry point into Xunzi's use of jiezhou is the discourse on music. So the key point here is that music works through patterned form. Xunzi emphasizes 曲直、反省、连肉, and 节奏. These formal features structure affective response. They make it possible for the good heart to be moved in a stable and directed way. This point is significant for the broader rhythm-first model. Moral affect for Xunzi is shaped through form. The movement of the heart is made possible by publicly available structures of sound, pattern, timing, and bodily participation. And this becomes even clearer in this passage. Here, rhythm becomes a bodily and collective technology. Listening to proper music expands one's will and intention. Holding ritual implementations and practicing movements such as bending and stretching makes one's appearance dignified. Moving through ritual positions and grasping the rhythm makes roles and ranks correct. and makes advance and retreat aligned. So this passage moves across several layers: sound and affect, gesture and body component, spatial arrangements, collective movement, and public alignment. Rhythm here is operative. It organizes bodies and positions, gestures, affective dispositions, and collective transitions, and makes coordinated action possible. Xunzi then makes the political significance explicit. Music is the great alignment of the world. This phrase should be understood as a claim about the capacity of music to bring differentiated persons into a shared pattern of coordination. Music trains bodies, affects, and social positions into a common rhythm. So this is why music in the Xunzi is not external ornamentation added to ethics or politics. It is a model of how public order is formed. It shows how patterned form can organize affect and space and movement and hierarchy into a shared field of response. The discourse on music therefore gives us the first major step in the argument. Rhythm makes alignment possible by organizing embodied participation. And this also allows us to see how Xunzi extends and transforms the Zhuangzian problem. Cooking's knife advances through the joints, openings, and resistance of the ox. His skill lies in sensing articulation and moving through it. Xunzi extends this insight into the domain of ritual and public order. Ritual does not merely move through a given structure. It gives human life articulated structures through which actions can continue. So, we just saw 奏道, right? So, Zhuangzi gives us 奏道, and Xunzi gives us something like 奏节. The carrying forward of articulated relations, roles, affects, and actions into a sustainable common world. However, this grammar is used across context, not just music, but governance. The discourse on music shows how rhythm works in musical and ritual performance. Enriching the state here shows how the same grammar becomes a political model. So even though 节奏 does not appear in this passage, the political imagination is already rhythmic. Xunzi speaks of 时和, 得序, 节其流, 开其源, and 时斟酌. Production, administration, resourceful, and political judgments are all described through temporal coordination, sequencing, regulated circulation, and timely adjustment. So this passage shows that political order for Xunzi depends on proper pacing of social processes. Sources must be opened, flows must be regulated, and actions must be adjusted according to time. Order emerges through sustained modulation. The point becomes explicit in a later passage from the same chapter. So this is one of the most important passages for my argument, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, sorry. Here, we can see qi appear at different levels. Okay, 修理以其朝, 正法以其官, 平正以其民. The result is 节奏其于朝, 百事其于官, 众数其于下. So this is a multi-level account of alignment. The court, the officials, and the people are not collapsed into one homogeneous mess. Each level has its own medium of alignment, ritual, law, and political administration. the shared order emerges through differentiated yet coordinated structures. So this passage also shows that qi is an operation. It is achieved through ritual cultivation, legal correction, and balanced governance. Alignment is made, sustained, and repaired. Okay, that's what I just said. Okay, next. The attracting men of worth. In this chapter, Xunzi adds another important dimension. Here, 节奏 concerns the calibration of intensity and social capacity. Xunzi says, 节奏愈冷而声名愈宽，节奏灵而稳而声名宽而安。So here, rhythm should be elevated and refined, while the people should be given room to breathe. When rhythm is elevated, it becomes patterned and refined. And when people are given ease and space, they become settled and secure. So when 节奏灵而稳而声名宽而安, the upper and lower levels become mutually sustainable. This is important because it prevents a coercive reading of rhythm. Xunzian rhythm is not dense surveillance or rigid control. It is a configuration of measure, intensity, and capacity. Order requires responsiveness to what people can bear, inhabit, and continue. The strengthening the state chapter gives an even sharper formulation. A state too has its sharpening and polishing. That is 礼义节奏. Political order is strengthened through ritual propriety and rhythm. This line makes clear that rhythm is part of the state's internal formation. It is what sharpens and stabilizes collective power. So from these passages, we can see that Xunzi's use of rhythm points to a shared grammar of coordination. In musical and ritual context, this grammar organizes sound, bodily movement, affective disposition, spatial arrangement, and collective transitions. In political context, it organizes roles, offices, procedures, expectations, and social conduct into a sustainable public order. Music and politics thus reveal the same underlying problem: how differentiated elements can be articulated, brought together, aligned, and sustained within a shared order. So, at this point, let me briefly return to the railway example with which I began. So the Japanese railway system offers a very vivid modern image, as I just said, of this non-single-centered form of qi, or alignment. Different railway companies have their own histories, routes, interests, and operational tempos. Yet they share transferable formats. These formats allow different systems to remain different and yet to enter into the same public rhythm. What is especially interesting, at least to an outsider like me, is that the system is not without authority, rules, or standardization. But authority does not appear simply as a single center imposing order from above. Rather, it is embedded in tickets, signs, platform lines, announcements, door positions, timetables, and transfer paths. So order is not merely commended, it is rhythmatized and environmentalized. So this is close to what I'm trying to describe through Xunzi. Ritual in this sense is not only a rule imposed on action, it is an environment of coordination. It shapes order, right? So perhaps we can say qi is not the reduction of plurality to sameness. It is the making of plurality into a shared field of movement. But also, this alignment is not only bodily alignment. It is also semantic and historic alignment. Ritual forms do not merely coordinate bodies in space and time, they also coordinate meanings. Clothing, sound, posture, food, dwelling, spatial distances, and ceremonial sequences are symbolic forms through which participants understand what a situation means, what kind of response is called for, and how their roles are to be taken up. So far, I have argued that Xunzi's rhythm produces alignment. Yet this argument does not end with alignment, even though I have spent a lot of time already. So I'm coming to the last part. Xunzi's account also moves from qi to ming. So the central issue is this. Once actions, roles, procedures, and voices are aligned, what kind of higher order public condition becomes possible? And my answer is collective clarity. To explain this, I turn to this term, 监听齐鸣. So first, we need to distinguish 监听 as an ideal in 监听齐鸣 from the defective form of 监听 that Xunzi criticizes elsewhere. In the ideal case, 监听 cannot mean that one ruler personally hears and processes everything. So Xunzi criticizes one-person model in true kings and hegemons. So here, 监听 has gone wrong by becoming single-point overload. The problem is not comprehensive hearing itself, but a structure in which hearing, judgment, and control are compressed into one center. The result is overload. The ruler tries to manage the near and the far, the visible and the hidden, the 1 and the 100. This is excess. It exceeds proper measure and collapses the distributed structure required for order. So effective hearing must therefore be distributed. It must be embedded in roles, offices, procedures, and forms of accountability. And the rule of a true king gives us a concrete institutional picture. It's actually a very long passage. He lists various offices and their responsibilities. I will just focus on the line concerning the grand steward here. So this line is crucial. Ideal 监听 appears together with 时机、度其功劳、论其庆赏, and 以时慎修. Hearing is part of a procedure. It involves periodic review, evaluation of merit, distribution of reward, and ongoing maintenance. So here, hearing is not passive reception. It is an institutional practice. It receives multiple inputs, evaluates them according to shared standard, connects them to responsibility, and returns them to the system through correction and reward. So this gives us a more precise meaning of ideal listening. It is distributed public hearing structured by offices, timing, review, and accountability. So now we can return to the famous passage from The Way to be a Lord. If we isolate the phrase 监听齐鸣, we might read it as a virtue of the ruler's mind. The ruler hears broadly and therefore becomes lucid. The following lines suggest that a wider structure. After 监听齐鸣, Xunzi says, 民愤直，叙事业，才知官能，若莫不治理. The result is clear division of offices, ordered affairs, and proper governance of capacities and functions. So this means that 明 here should be understood as a system-level condition. It is the clarity produced when multiple inputs are received, sorted, aligned, and made mutually accountable within a public structure. So the clarity belongs to the political field as a whole. And the next line confirms this. This passage describes a rearrangement of the whole field of visibility, access, advancement, and accountability. Good tendencies become easier to support. corrupt tendencies become harder to sustain. Public routes are opened and private channels are closed. So this is why I call Qiming collective clarity. It is not the simple addition of many individual clear minds. It is an emergent condition generated through distributed hearing, alignment, office differentiation, review, and public scale. And this does not exclude individual mean, which is clearly important. He shows how individual clarity and system level clarity needs to be co-produced through public rhythms. So in this sense, 监听齐鸣 completes the movement from 节 to 奏 to 齐. The rhythm that first organizes bodily movement and ritual performances later organizes offices, procedures, voices, and public judgment. When rhythm becomes aligned public practice, it generates clarity at the level of a system. So a community does not merely move together through rhythm. It becomes intelligible to itself through rhythm. And collective clarity is not final harmony. It is more like a public condition of sustainable calibration. So different voices can enter, errors can be pointed out, private gates can be blocked, public ways can be reopened. Collective clarity does not mean that everyone already sees the same thing. It means that the whole system has the capacity to let perspectives correct one another and to guide judgment back into a shared public field. So this also gives us a way to understand Xunzi's political realism. He doesn't assume that people already share deep understanding of the way. He's quite clear that people can be aligned through the way without being able to share its underlying reasons in full. The passage often summarized through the phrase 民意以道而不可与共故 is important here. Public order does not require that everyone align with complete theoretical insight into the grounds of order. It requires shared practices through which people can learn, inherit, and sustain a common scale. So this is where Xunzi's view becomes especially important and interesting. Public order begins with operable forms. People enter forms before they fully understand them. Through practice, repetition, correction, and public alignment, these forms become intelligible. Understanding grows through participation in ordered rhythm. Reflection remains important, of course, yet reflection is supported by public forms. Judgment becomes possible because there are shared rhythms, shared roles, shared points of comparison, and shared procedures of correction. Thus, Xunzi invites us to rethink the relation between form and understanding. Form is the medium through which moral and political intelligibility becomes possible. So, let me end with an image. So in this photograph, the figures making the staircase do not merge into sameness. They occupy different heights, angles, postures, and directions of attention. Yet they form a shared composition. Difference is not erased. It is arranged, made visible, and sustained. This is the kind of order I have tried to describe through Xunzi, not uniformity, but coordinated differences. There is not a single center of command, but the emphasis is on public form, through which many positions can become mutually intelligible. So, this talk started with the question, before anything can count in favor of anything, what has already been put in place? And let me conclude by returning to the arc with which I began. Mencius shows that how ethical life begins from affective salience, something pressed upon make a sustainable and intelligible order through the ritual technologies of rhythm alignment and collective clarity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. I'd like to invite our first commentator, Dr. Sojun Park. Dr. Sojun Park is professor of Korean philosophy at Sungkyunkwan University and director of the Institute of Korean Philosophy and Culture, where she leads the K Academic Expansion Project. Her research focuses on Korean philosophy, comparative philosophy, and the philosophy of music, with particular interests in ritual, emotion, and public order in East Asian thought. She is the author of《流动的音乐思维：先秦诸子音乐星探》in 2016 and numerous articles, including On Sound, Reconstructing a Xunzian Perspective of Music in 2015, and The Dynamic Characteristics of Jeong, a New Perspective on the Korean Neo-Confucian 4-7 Debate in 2023. She is currently completing a monograph entitled Korean Philosophy and Culture: An Introduction to a Living Tradition by Bloomsbury Press. Dr. Park, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for kind introduction. First of all, thank you for the fascinating paper. I enjoyed really a lot, and I'm very much grateful for the opportunity to comment it. What I found particularly exciting is that your work reminds me of a question I explored several years ago in an article on the musical metaphor in Chinese aesthetics. There, I argue that Chinese intellectual tradition often employ to like spend much time for that, but in that sense, actually, the music functions not simply as an artistic genre, but as a model of order, vitality, coordination, and transformation. And your paper really made me want to pursue this line of inquiry further, and particularly in relation to Xunzi's concept of jiezhou. Although there are so many interesting points to discuss, but I would like to offer 3 points that may help stimulate future research, perhaps collaborative ones. First, I wonder whether the distinction between what you call the Yueji line and Xunzi line. You didn't mention the Yueji line much, but actually in the previous draft, you mentioned, yeah, so, and then in our previous discussion. And these two lines should remain only I mean, I think that that distinction is useful for us, I mean, temporarily, but it is useful for analytic purposes, but in the long run, I worry that it may unintentionally reinforce an image of Xunzi as a primarily a political and ethical thinker, while treating music as a separate domain from which he merely borrowed vocabulary. So, for example, yeah, my own suspicion is somewhat different from your division. And then I believe you also actually kind of echo with my point. Because my point is that rather than saying that Xunzi imported a musical term into political discourse, this is I mean, very common in the previous discussion. But although you criticize that like kind of existing point of view, but still you are call this the other side as a Xunzi line and Uizi line, right? But I think because we might say that he identified and conceptualized something fundamental within music itself. Meaning is that the dynamic of stopping and proceeding. If you just very simply read 节奏, then it means stopping and proceeding, concept, right? And alteration that the traditions would recognize as a rhythm. But as you as you understand, actually you like quoted some part from the Shijing and the older text. It didn't have jiezhou, this concept itself. They traditionally used zhou, but zhou simply means play there, right? So classical Chinese musical theory has long discussed pitch system, 12律 or 6律, or tonal organizations such as a pentatonic scale, 五声, or harmony of timbre, 八音, etc. But they never actually coined and actually grasped the concept or pattern inside, which is comparable to the rhythm. And so rhythm itself, the term rhythm, conceptual rhythm, or the term 节奏 itself is rarely very almost no one actually conceptualized as an independent category for music. So it is remarkable that I mean Xunzi seems to have recognized this feature within music and given it a name, 节奏. So, and then, as you mentioned, like 曲子 and 连肉 and 节奏 and the 反整, those terms all coined by Xunzi, right? So, then Xunzi is really the founder of political discourse of 节奏. I think he's also for architects of musical discourse of 节奏. So from Xunzi's own perspective, I believe what we call the Yueji line and Xunzi line may have been integrated into one or in the same, I think. That is the first point. And the second point is that
Dr.
I
Park,
found your transition or movement from,
it's
oh, okay.
so maybe
I already, okay, sorry. Then second one is like conceptual history of qi. Okay, so basically, I really believe your transition from the jeju to qi is very compelling. But I think you'd better to extend your like search and research on the concept of qi. Qi is very central. Not only the comparison between Zhuangzi and Xunzi, actually, within the Confucian tradition, actually their approach and their interpretation of qi are not, including Confucius and Mencius, are very different from Xunzi, I believe. And then third one is a simple but very crucial, because later, apart from, I mean, the acceptance of Xunzian, like Xunzian lines of 节奏 were not enough, except for the like 陈氏外传 and by Hutton, just three cases, but all the cases are almost direct reproduction of Xunzi. So no one really expanded and interpreted newly and innovated of the Xunzi's line. So how to interpret this development? That part also quite crucial, I think, points you can engage in and develop further, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Wang, in the interest of time, maybe I'll invite all three commentators to speak, and then you can address comments at the end so we can maybe streamline things a little bit. So up next, we have comments from Dr. Nai Xu. Dr. Nai Xu is an assistant professor at National Taiwan University. His research focuses on early Confucian ethics, political philosophy, and aesthetics. He holds a PhD in religious studies from Indiana University, Bloomington, and has published in Dao, Journal of Religious Ethics and Philosophy, East and West. He is also the co-translator of Dai De's Record of Ritual, Da Dai Li Qi. Dr. Xu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Ellie, for this very stimulating paper. I really like it, and I think it's an admirable effort to kind of tease out a kind of political order or public order that is not from one single point of view or one single person, but kind of from a public procedure, kind of emerge of this order. And I think the 节奏 part is especially insightful. I never really noticed the 节奏 plays so much role in Xunzi's political theory. But I think there are three parts, right? 节奏 and the qi and the 齐名. So I think I have 4 points. The first two is more about the textual issues, and the last two is probably more philosophical in a way. So I consider the first question is about how do we actually understand the qi in Xunzi. So you're saying it's alignment without flattering difference, which is very appealing, right? And also I consider qi is very important for you to transition from 节奏 and to 齐名. It's almost the kind of central, the connecting concept to my understanding. So, but let's think about what exactly is the music image there in the 乐记, a 乐论 passage. You're saying there's kind of a alignment without flagging differences, right? But qi can also be a kind of uniformity in that sense because there's so many different kind of dances. Okay, imagine the dance like the street dance today, right? They dance to the same music, to the same beat, but their movements are very different, and they don't dance in the same time. They don't really dance in alignment sense. But in the Xunzi's case, I wanted the 进退得其 is actually a stronger sense of uniformity there than your interpretation allow. Probably that really this kind of formation there, they move and backbone at the same time. They even are using the same instruments, right? The same kind of how to say decoration or whatever, right? Different, the same kind of clothing, the same kind of movement. So probably the stronger sense of like a uniformity there in the particularly in the. So the question is about what kind of music, what kind of dance is actually what's actually in Xunzi's mind. So I think there's one difficulty. And another difficulty I think is from the 节奏 transition to the 监听齐名, where I think 齐 is very important. I might be wrong because I feel like your understanding of 监听 is somehow rely on a 齐名, understand the 齐, especially 齐, already interpreted as a coordinated sense instead of a uniform sense. But if the 齐 has not solved yet, and then that reading will kind of it doesn't. It's not really circular, but it's kind of you rely on a 齐名, especially 齐 is not, at least according to me, is not really fully development in a sense, right? Consider all the other different possibilities. So another issue about the 齐名 is, I think the 君道 chapter is your key passage, and you want to say it's a kind of it's a collective clarity that emerged from the public procedure, collective procedure. But the 君道 chapter, to my understanding, is actually emphasizing what the rulers should do. It's kind of like individual agency. The ruler needs to do something. So the passage, especially the passage itself, it ends with a quotation from Shi to kind of emphasize what the character or what disposition or virtue the ruler has. So I wonder the key passage is still talking about what the ruler should do. So the 监听齐名 is probably, I don't know, in the context, can still be a personal individual action. And there are actual textual evidence showing that the 齐名 is probably a qualities of a 圣人, for example. Like in the 修身, we have the 齐名的不解,圣人也. And in the 儒下, we have the phrase, it's about 名不能齐法家之所不及. It's describing the Yaru. I understand that you're saying that individual meaning is still important, but I just want to push maybe the 齐名 is still a personal capacity or trait instead of something, I don't know, emerge from the public process. Right? There are some. And I think the third and fourth question, the third question is more about in the so-called mutual intelligibility. So I'm wondering what kind of so you say the community becomes intelligible to itself. I just wonder what the mechanism is. And it seems like you're emphasizing on affective and the bodily dimension. It seems like kind of tacit coordination, and they will understand there's an order guiding us, right? But isn't there kind of a normative danger there? Like, how do we make sure the kind of order we are just not get used to this order, right? If it's more like we are internalize something that we work together without fully realizing the reason why we're doing that, right? If, of course, you say a reflection is important, but I think still something to really flesh out how this kind of what kind of understanding is really there, right? Or whether fittingness itself can really provide a normative or power. And the last question is, well, if, as I said, the tacit coordination alone doesn't really deliver this kind of political intelligibility, maybe there's another different way. I'm sure you're familiar. So the question will be about, Xunzi talks about so much about deliberation, debates, right, discussion, articulation, the position, like the Junzi needs to speak out your opinions, right, engage in demonstration, the discussion. I wonder what kind of a role this kind of a articulation or debates, or okay, so-called this deliberative process play in the kind of rhythmic, the kind of emergence or how to say that, the rhythm-like political structure, right? So can we say that like probably the rhythm structure you are talking about provide kind of background for this kind of deliberation to happen, and the true intelligibility is probably happens in this kind of deliberation. I don't know, probably there's some kind of anyway. So this is the basically 4 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final commentator today is Dr. Eric Hutton. Dr. Eric Hutton is a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah. He's the translator of Xunzi, the complete text, published by Princeton University Press. I happen to have my copy right out here with me. And edited the Tao Companion to the Philosophy of Xunzi, published by the Springer in 2016. Together with Justin Tewald, he co-edits the translation series Oxford Chinese Thought, and will soon be publishing a translation of the Jielao and Yulao chapters of the Hanfeizi as a part of the volume co-edited with Eirik Lang Harris. Dr. Hutton, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Paul and Ellie having me here, and also thank you, Ellie, for the paper. In her paper, I think Ellie's latched on to a number of interesting aspects of Xunzi's thought that, to my knowledge, haven't gotten much attention in previous scholarship on Xunzi. And in my comments today, I want to focus on one particular set of issues raised by her discussion, and to present a way of potentially redescribing some of the ideas that she's highlighting. And I think the redescription offers us a way of connecting parts of the text that she discusses with some parts that she doesn't discuss. However, Ellie may not entirely like what I propose, and if so, then hopefully these remarks will spur her to clarify her own view or maybe revise it. Now, most specifically, one of the key ideas in Ellie's talk is that Xunzi uses rhythm as what she, in her phraseology, as a public medium of alignment. And that for Xunzi, this rhythm is embodied in, instilled through, and sustained via ritual practice. Now, Ellie doesn't spend a lot of time explaining exactly what she means by rhythm, but she does, talk through at least some of the ideas associated with it and with the term jie that serves as the underlying Chinese notion on which she's focused. Given the centrality of rhythm to her account, though, I think it's worth drilling into that notion a bit further. And especially for people like me who aren't trained as musicians, rhythm, that notion can be a bit fuzzy. But I gather that it has a more precise meaning in modern music theory, something like the pattern of long and short notes and pauses, long and short notes and silences in a piece of music. And it's unclear to me how well Xunzi's conception of jie matches such a definition, though offhand I inclined to doubt that it matches it exactly, even when Xunzi's just using it as a musical term. But for the time being, let's just work with this English definition of rhythm as that kind of pattern of long and short notes and silences, because even if that definition isn't a perfect match for jie, the English definition will still suffice to bring out the point that I want to make, which is as follows. And I take it that the kind of paradigm scenario in Xunzi that Ellie has in mind, and which he explicitly references, is a case where people listen to a piece of music and align their bodily movements to the rhythmic structure of that music, such that they all move in a kind of coordinated way, even if they're not making all the exact same movements. But we have to go back to Xunai's concerns about that. At any rate, that situation, I think, can be readily described as a case of rhythm serving as a public medium of alignment. At least when I think about how that coordination becomes possible, though, What seems to me to do a lot of the work is not simply the fact that there are, say, a series of long and short notes and pauses, but moreover, that the series is repeated. The perceptible repetition is a large part of what constitutes the rhythm as a pattern and allows listeners to identify what the pattern is, to predict what will happen next, and then to base their movements on that prediction, such that they wind up coordinated. And if that's right, then what facilitates alignment is a more particular feature of musical rhythm, or perhaps even more fundamentally of the pulse of the music into which the rhythm fits, since that likewise consists in a kind of repetitive series. And now, using this observation to look back at Xunzi, we can see in other passages that do not invoke either jie or qi, the other term that Ellie discusses, we can see in those other passages a similar kind of connection between repeated predictable phenomena and the coordination of human activities. So for example, the Tianlun chapter contains one passage, and let me see if I can share my screen here for a second, because it will be helpful if everybody can look at the passage at the same time. Okay, everybody see that one? Okay, good. So the Tianlun chapter contains this passage that says, with respect to heaven, focus only on those manifest phenomena that can be anticipated. With respect to earth, focus only on those manifest places which are suitable for growing. With respect to the four seasons, focus only on that manifest sequence by which work is to be arranged. With respect to yin and yang, focus only on those manifest harmonies which can be used to order things. Now, at least part of the point in context is that although there may be irregularities in all the various things that are listed here, the irregularities are much less important than the regularities, because the latter provide a basis for planning and organization. And in the case of astronomy and meteorology, those regularities consist in cycles of the celestial bodies and weather. And in turn, in another passage, we see Xunzi aiming to transpose that model to the human realm. And this passage occurs in the Wangzhi chapter. So now let me switch
Hey,
to that
Eric,
one.
Eric,
Oops,
you
sorry,
didn't you
I had
didn't
the wrong
show the
passage.
last one. Yeah.
Okay, it didn't show. Sorry, this is the passage I was just on. So just read it again. Sorry, I had it focused on the wrong one. So with respect to heaven, focus only on those manifest phenomena that can be anticipated. With respect to earth, focus only on those manifest places which are suitable for growing. With respect to four seasons, focus only on that which manifests sequence by which work is to be arranged. Right, and especially with that notion of the sequence, what we're talking about is really the cycle here. So then in the other passage, we get the following, which says, use the proper categories to manage muddled cases and use the one right standard to manage the myriad situations, beginning and then ending, ending and then beginning again, just like the way that a jade loop has no endpoints. And it continues on a little later. When the positions of Lord and Minister, father and son, older brother and younger brother, husband and wife all begin and then end and then begin again, when they're part of the same order with heaven and earth and persist as long as the myriad generations, this is called the Great Root. Now, it's not immediately clear exactly what Xunzi has in mind here, but the idea of cycles in human life is apparent enough. Although the passage doesn't mention ritual, other parts of the text show that Xunzi takes the position of Lord and Minister, father and son, and so forth, to be highly dependent upon ritual for their existence. And therefore, it seems virtually certain that for him, the cycle that's mentioned here is precisely one that's embodied in, instilled through, and sustained via ritual practice. And that point then brings me to my closing observation in response to Ellie's paper. So she suggests that Xunzi's answer to the problem of how differentiated actors, roles, affects, and institutions become coordinated in practice lies in ritual rhythm. Based on the ideas I've been tracing, we can flesh out this mechanism of ritual rhythm a little further. Scholars of ritual have previously noted the way that rituals are often built up around repeating phenomena and cycles in nature, but they've also noted how rituals can create cycles that are not themselves part of nature. One way of then understanding the effectiveness of ritual rhythm as a public medium of alignment in Xunzi's view is to see ritual as inheriting from natural processes a kind of cyclical character that it then reproduces in different forms in human life. And that repetitiveness and repeatability is, as in the musical case, the, or at least one prime driver of how people come to align their behaviors. So in sum, I'm offering Ellie a way of refining the notion of ritual rhythm and perhaps more narrowly specifying its operative content. And now let's see what she thinks of all that.
Thanks. I'll invite Dr. Wang to respond briefly.
Thank you all for really good questions. This is why this is great. So I'm happy to think with you together about this and try to make some initial attempts to answer some of them, and we'll most likely have to work on them later. So for Jeong's, I think this is so interesting, right? Like Jeong emphasized on music and think I should put more attention on music. And in some ways, Eric wants to say, don't talk so much about music, talk about the patterns behind music, and which is shared with the political and ritual domain, which is, I think both are really good points. And so let's start with Sojong's text. And also, it really just appeared during that time in Xunzi and also in Li Ji, right? And we all know that Xunzi and Li Ji are very, in some ways, they kind of copy, who copies who, don't know, but they kind of share a lot of similar lines. So 节奏 only appeared in 乐记, in the Li Ji, and in Xunzi. And the interesting thing about this connection is also the difference, which is that in the 乐记, you see much more about how the music brings alignment, while in the Xunzi, he directly moves away from music and start talking about the 礼义节奏 or other 节奏 in the political domain. So in my interpretation, I think I do want to put attention to the common grammar or common collaborative grammar or common idea pattern behind these different uses in different contexts. And and as I said before, the very interesting thing about Xunzi is he actually directly uses it in political context and not in music context, even though the book of music is also in Xunzi, right? So he also has those, but he just has other things too. Okay, so I agree that I do think I do not want to say that music is a separate domain, because I think during their time, ritual ceremonies are often accompanied with music, so they are played together, right? So to that extent, right, there is also dance, right? So to that extent, I don't think Xunzi has to think that they are different domains, but they do. I do think that as an abstract idea, it is something that is shared on these different contexts. So it's a cross context grammar again. So I think Jeong points out, pick up a very important, I think a very important point that I also very much share, which is the structure of 节奏 itself is right. 节奏 is, I was mentioning, it's a segmentation relation, and so is like bringing forward. It's a kind of movement. So when you put them together, it's like a pause, because when you make segments, right, then you kind of pause. You're segmenting a continuous thing, so you are pausing at times. So it's like pause, move, pause, move. It's a I think an intensive relation. Okay, so I think that kind of pattern can be in music as well as in other domains. And that's the thing that's being picked up. And it's realized in different ways. So it's realized in time and space and history, how we connect to history, or how we connect to the or how our bodies connect, like how our different organs connect. So there are different ways how this tensive relation show up in. So I think that is really cool idea. Okay. So, right. And then I do want to do some conceptual history for Qi, and that's an important reminder. Thank you very much. And also, why are later ones, later appearances of 节奏 only really just copied Xunzi and not developed the idea? Why? I don't know why. I do want to figure this out. Let's figure this out together. Okay, so it should be a collaborative work. Okay, so Nai, I think these are all very important questions, and I do want to. I do think that, do we still want to say there is some kind of uniformity in qi in the musical case? I think if you want to match the beat, right? If you want to, in some ways, align, there will be some kind of sameness in the most abstract way. But do we want to understand as right, straightforward uniformity? I do think there is room for that. I think the more important thing is coordination, right? Alignment, and not it doesn't have it. He clearly stresses the idea that the qi, you can't just focus on the sameness part. You have to appreciate the difference. And I think there is a lot of this pattern of thought in his Xunzi's ideas. So you see a lot of the emphasis on division and harmony. It is harmony through division, right? So 分而合 kind of idea. So 别异 and then 合同. So these always work together, and it's not just 合同 or not just the same, right? So or E, think about his idea of E, which is right. Our minds know differentiations, right? 心会知道两, but not be blinded by 两 and being able to focus and attend to what bring them together is E. So again, these ideas, they might have a narrow sense which emphasizes on oneness or sameness, but again, it's always more properly understood in a tensive system and tensive relation. And so it's always a more complicated. And so I don't think my interpretation of Jianting is relying completely on qi. And could it be it's also always just about one person? One thing I want to just briefly talk about here is it's never gonna be just one person, not the ruler. Because even in the Xunzi, the Junzi are plural. So there are plurality of Junzi. There is the Chen, so he's the one of the, I think maybe the first one, who talks about the sagely administers. So Shen Chen is his ideas, right? So you can't just have one Junzi. I want to have many of them. Yeah. So mutual intelligibility, what is it? Could it be that we're just accustomed to the order? I think people do get into the form before they have to agree. And that's, I think, the beautiful thing about this, which is, right, let's leave the ideologies and the reasons and beliefs aside, and we just come into the space together. So, and how do we have this mutual intelligibility? I think Eric just gave us a very good answer, which has to do with repetition, cyclicality, and predictability, right? So these ideas are ways that we kind of can understand each other because it's predictable. But I also think that it doesn't have to be just repeated or cyclic. I think that's a very, very important aspect. But I do think that a lot of times you pick up something when you enter it, and that's because it might echo some of your previous experiences in other places for different reasons. So rhythms, right? 节奏 work. I don't think it has to be you're just used to it, right? When you first listen to Bach or some Mahler or right Beethoven, you don't have to already listen and be able to predict it, but you can understand what's going on in the music to some extent, right? Not completely, but to some extent. So I think there is this other part that is possible that we echo together without it being just a custom or just a habit. So in the last question about Nai is Bian, and how is it connecting to other forms of engagement in order? I think this is a very important question. I think for Xunzi, there are multi-layers of order formation. So Bian is a lot of times at the the linguistic level, right? At the verbal articulation. That's already a very some of the last resort. So he doesn't think that the wise ruler actually debates with other people because people are not there to debate. They're not at the place to debate. So again, this is not really about reason or like offering an argument, but it's more like you have to get in there and get the basic shared understanding. And then we can talk about things when we're all there. Yeah, so I think this also kind of addresses Eric's question. And then, of course, this is a very important question. I do want to think more about what's more than repetition, cyclability, and predictability. I do think there is still, like I just said, there are novel cases where you get into it and you already resonate, right? And because of there's some kind of rhythm you can catch on. So maybe it's not just that. And also it involves continuous adjustment and a repair. So we're not just following what has been done before and it's a convention and a habit and we just stay there. But we need to still try to check to make sure when things go wrong, we need to be able to repair, right? So how do you do that? Then you may have maybe some other rhythm going on or some deeper rhythm going on that helps you come back to correct what's going on that's not doing very well, right? So, or spot something that's changing and decide whether that's a good thing or not. So I think that's also something I want to put on the table. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Due to our time constraints, I think we'll just take one question from the audience, and if there's no question, I'm happy to ask one as well. I'll give a moment for anyone to put up their hand. Going once. Oh yeah, okay. Julius, you
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the talk, Ellie. This was super interesting, and all the comments were very stimulating. There's just one very brief question, and then some thoughts to what you were just discussing, and I'll try to make it brief. I was especially also interested in the concept of jie in particular, and in sort of your suggestion that the term articulation might be sort of the ideal way to try to put some more maybe conceptual structure on what that means. I was just curious about what you make of sort of all sorts of other occurrences of jie where it seems in the Xunzi where it seems that it's not sort of talking about an ideal form of articulation or sort of has this very strong normative ideal dimension, right? For instance, in the I think in the Tianlun, there's also this line about right if the king of Chu is followed by 10,000 chariots, or if the Junzi only gets to eat straw and drink water and lives this very meager form of existence, this is not due to wisdom or to stupidity, respectively, but it's due to jie. So it seems that jie also has this maybe a wrong form of articulation, but I'm not sure whether here it is this kind of articulation that you have in mind, but perhaps it is. So this is just a question of whether you also account for these sort of forms of misalignment, perhaps, and just curious what you think about this sort of form of misalignment there is in the Xunzi. And second, sort of following Eric's part in drawing in perhaps other parts of the Xunzi that you haven't talked about. I think when it comes to sort of determining what counts as a successful form of Jie or Jiezhou or Qi, right? One thing that Eric stressed, I suppose, is in a way the importance that Xunzi places on these observable regularities, from which we have much to learn, not only in terms of what counts as something that fits these criteria, but also how to attain something. But I suppose the other thing, if in the Zhuangzi, for instance, right, and I think this fits with the term articulation that you prefer for describing what Jie is, because it's not only a sort of simple alignment to something that is publicly observable, but it involves a certain kind of creative subjective input too. And when it comes to that, right, the way that we determine in what way this sort of activity is proper is not by giving an account of what it is that we're observing or what it is that we can observe, but it's about the constitution of the subject itself, right? And I suppose this is where in the Zhuangzi, obviously, we get a lot about this and mainly about this, but we also do get this in the Xunzi. So sort of the second question would be, in which extent, for instance, you think what Xunzi says on Xinshu or Xinxue or whatever, for instance, in the JB chapter, etc., how you think that plays in?
A very quick response.
Thank you. Yeah, it has to be very quick. Okay. Yeah, these are really good questions. Thank you, Julius. I'm very happy that I get this chance to explain a little bit about and also think with you more about articulation. Okay, so I think articulation is a very important word here. But first, I want to just make sure that when I say articulation, it does not mean ideal articulation. It just means articulation. So what does that mean? So when we articulate, right, when we make segments so that something else can join later, right? So when we do that, we can do it in some ways not very good. In some ways it's good, right? So it's just one way to divide or one way to segment and one way to bring it out. When we cut something in a way, then we are actually interpreting it, right? Or we are actually showing a face of it, like showing how it can be done in this way. And it can be done in many, many different ways. There is no one way of articulation for a continuous life, right? So it's always an interpretation. It's always what you see or what people can see together. So now this goes to your Zhuangzi question. I'm completely agreeing with you that a lot of times this has to do with creative subjective input, right? For the cooking, he does have a job, right? He does want to like carve the up in the most effortless way, but it definitely involves how he interacts with the thing. But I want to say, why do I do the arc from Mencius to Zhuangzi to Xunzi? Is I think this idea is shared among them. Knowing is always interacting. When you know something, it's not there is a thing, and then you know it in by itself. But it's more that how you know it in a sense that you know how you relate to it. So you are always in this knowing and you're always in the relation. And that's why it becomes tricky, right? Because if it's just subjective, then we always say, well, then what happens to relativism, right? So it's just like everybody has their own subjective appreciation of a thing. Then there are other things that will come in to help us calibrate. And that is how we can make it public. So right now I'm not making the objective subjective divide. I'm saying that it's always a subjective engagement when people are there. But what we subjectively engage can also be shared publicly. And that's, I think, a very interesting thing. That's the continuation from Mencius to Zhuangzi to Xunzi. So I don't think all the jiezous are ideal. There are different ways to cut things up and different ways to advance them, and then it's wrong. So it's not ideal, or it doesn't click, or it doesn't align. And so that really depends, right, on So what fits, right? What's fitting, what's 合宜, really depends on what we're trying to do, what we're trying to do together, who we are, and what the thing is, right? It's always depends on all these things together. So that's why you need a quite complex model for this kind of thing, and not just right, this is the true law or something, and then be done with it. So so I hope that kind of answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass things back to Paul, I think, but I think we're closing. Sorry, not so sure where things go.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks, everyone.